Our focus this past unit has been on morality. Is there a right and a wrong? And if so, how do we find out what it is? And who decides what's right and wrong? Why is the world full of pain and suffering? These are all loaded questions, as we've seen, but sometimes the answers to these questions have a tendency to seem far removed from the real world. Defining the problem of evil may be helpful in the classroom, but how does that help me when I'm actually experiencing pain and loss in my own life? The danger with so much of this stuff is that we forget that these questions actually affect us daily. We also find that if we look at our lives and look at some of the things we've lived through, deaths of loved ones, parents divorcing, decisions about school and future, the choice to cheat or not to cheat, our discussion on the topic of morality is always more than just the discussion. We find that it's actually something that affects us on a personal level. A writer named Friedrich Buechner is fond of saying that we need to listen to our lives. It's important to look at some of our own experiences because they shed light on our own worldviews, on what we believe about morality and what's right and wrong. It's more than just about listening to your heart or deciding how you feel about things. It's about hearing the questions within and asking honestly if there are really any answers. Each of us lives our life according to a set of principles, whether we know it or not. Sometimes we need to take a step back to see just what it is that we really believe. Oftentimes, we say one thing but we do another. It's amazingly easy to go through life without really knowing what we believe, simply because we don't listen to our lives. Next, we'll talk to my dad, Ravi Zacharias, about what our own lives and our own stories tell us about morality. We're back again with my dad, and for those of you wondering at home, I can promise you this is not what our normal dinner conversation is like, which I'm pleased to say. But Dad, on a obviously serious note, this time we're talking about evil, good and evil more specifically. What is a good person?
That is a very fair question to ask a Buddhist, to ask a Hindu, and even a Muslim. But the answers you will get from within the Judeo-Christian framework are radically different to any one of these. It is the fact that in the Christian faith, you are never righteous enough to earn the kingdom of God, as it were, to earn your way to heaven. The sequence is given to us in the Old Testament, where you first get the people rescued out of bondage, then they're given the 10 Commandments, and then they're given the prescription for worship. So redemption, righteousness, worship. That is always the chronology. You can never alter that. So to answer your question, a person is never really ultimately good until they are first redeemed or have first come to God for forgiveness. Forgiveness is followed by goodness, and goodness ultimately to worship. So if you're asking what is a good person over against what is a good deed, that would be the answer that the Judeo-Christian worldview would give to you. Redemption, righteousness, worship.
Okay, well, we've talked about what makes a person good. On the other hand, what about evil? How can we define it? You know, we frequently think of examples like Hitler and the Holocaust as definitions of evil, but we don't see those every day, but we still see evil every day, don't we?
We do, and I think that's part of the hazard of defining evil, but part of the help in defining evil. If you only define people like Hitler and the Stalinistic slaughters and so on as evil, then you have to ask your question, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the volume of people killed that makes them evil, or the fact that any person was killed? And during the Nuremberg trials, you know, one person made the comment that once he had killed the first person, the rest of it, he wasn't bothered. There was no issues with his conscience anymore. So it was not that tens of thousands were slaughtered, but it is the fact that tens of thousands of times the sacred was violated. And every time the sacred is violated, it is either intentionally or unintentionally an act of evil. The acts of errors we call of omission and of commission. So let me put it this way. Evil is ultimately that which violates the purposes of God for life and for living in community with each other.
Can you expand a little bit more on the worldviews and how they address the issues of good and evil?
Yes, actually, it would be very interesting to even, if you take, for example, the writings of some pantheistic scholars and so on. They will never use the word sin. They don't like to use it. They would rather use the word evil or wrongdoing or falling short, karma, whatever it is. In the Islamic framework, they will talk about good deeds over against bad deeds. In Buddhism, you will talk about right thinking, right action, right conduct, right objects, right objectives, and so on. But in all of them, there is no clear definition of what the sinful heart really indicates. What the Bible tells you is that you are a person of intrinsic worth created for a relationship with God, and anything that comes between you and God becomes that barrier of sin or evil or an object that keeps you from knowing God. There are worlds of difference in the way the pantheistic worldview would illustrate it. I know some pantheistic writers like Deepak Chopra and all who don't even use the word sin. They don't like to use the word sin. They use a useful or a not useful term. And then when they come up against the Hitlers, they don't know what to do with it. So in one sense, those extremes help us to understand what it is when even the minute gets carried over to such extremes.
You mentioned life being sacred. And if I'm being honest, if I hadn't grown up getting to hear you and others speak, I wouldn't know what that actually means. So first of all, what does it mean to say life is sacred? And secondly, how does that filter down into our day-to-day lives?
I think this, of all one-liners, is the hardest to understand, especially in Western culture. When you think even of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and so on, you see this line, we sign this with our sacred honor. What does that mean? That really means it is something that's inviolable, that we have treated this with respect and with, to allow me the term, sort of with religious commitment and dogmatism here. What it really means is that life is of essential worth as a gift from God, and it is not the gift of the state. It is not the gift of the state that your life is sacred. It is the gift of God. Now, take that to the Ten Commandments. When you talk about them in whatever order you want to, it means this: your life is sacred, sexuality is sacred, your wealth is sacred, your time is sacred, your relationships are sacred, your marriage is sacred, and so is your neighbor's. In other words, you cannot encroach upon that which is a trust given to that individual by the gift of God, not just by the gift of the state. That's why a Christian should actually always have a higher standard than a person who's not, because I respect my neighbor's property and my neighbor's marriage, not just because the state tells me I have no right to encroach upon it, but because God tells me that. If you look at the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, when he's being repeatedly tempted, he said, I can't do this to you, because if I do this, I'll be violating the law of God. He didn't say, I'll be violating just your husband. He didn't say, I'll just be violating the law of the land. He said, this is at the highest level. I'll be violating the law of God. Sacredness is of intrinsic worth, separated for the ultimate purposes of God and inviolable by anybody else.
Talking about good and evil, talking about our life having value from God. I've heard you say before that the moral argument is, you think, the best argument for the existence of God. Can you tell us what that means and why you believe it's the strongest
It can
argument?
be put very simply. You know, whenever people talk about evil, they actually assume that such a thing is good. When they assume that such a thing is good, they assume such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. And when they assume a moral law, they must assume a moral lawgiver. Why do we assume a moral lawgiver? Because ultimately, when you raise the question of evil, it's either raised by a person or about a person, which means either the question raiser or the object of the question is assumed to have intrinsic worth, and that can only be so if we are the creation of God, not in any other way. So to me, the moral argument is actually quite inescapable. And by the way, that's why you will find strident atheists now trying to do one of two things: either try to find something rotten in Jesus's life to make him look not as good as the scriptures represent him to be, or number two, to try to make all moral reasoning purely some kind of a cerebral activity, and combined with the chemistry of the body, we therefore think of good and bad. But at all times, they will assume it to be ought, and they have to assume that their own thinking is not just cerebrally and chemically driven, but they're standing over and above it to make a meaningful statement about this kind of thinking.